This is part two of my series on the letter J and the name Jesus. I've returned after having read some more books and delved even more deeply into the history of the English language, the history of the letter J, and the name Jesus. The books are listed at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. As I mentioned in the last presentation, part one of this series, I embarked on this study because of a flyer that's been making its way around the internet, which says, "Did you know that the letter J is no more than 600 years old? So, how can a man who lived over 2,000 years ago be named Jesus? It says it's impossible." In part one of this series, I said that even though this statement was just plain silly, I met people who actually believed it, and so I took it on as a project to find out whether there was any truth to it. If you can, please listen to part one of this series on YouTube. The link is down below. In this video, which is part two of the series, I will be discussing a bit more about vowels and the history of the English alphabet. I'm also going to talk a bit about the letter Y and the name Yeshua. Now, Yeshua is Jesus' name in Hebrew, and there are people who only refer to Jesus by this name, Yeshua. It's really important when we talk about ancient names that we understand ancient names from an ancient Near East perspective and not from a modern day one. And finally, I'm going to talk about names and titles again from a biblical and an ancient Near East perspective. Now, let's begin part two of this series. I'm going to start off with vowels and use vowels in the Hebrew language as an example. Ancient languages had no vowels. Example, ancient Hebrew, also known as the Biblical Hebrew, had no vowels. They were added later. So somewhere between the 6th and the 10th century, a group of Jewish scholars called the Masoretes, meaning the traditionalists, wrote the Masoretic text, a Hebrew translation of the Bible, which added dots and dashes to assist Jewish readers pronounce Hebrew words correctly. So the primary aim of this early Middle Age text was to give vocalization to the text. So think about it. If boat was simply written as BT without any vowels, it could mean boat or boot or bout or beat or beat. How would we know the difference? So vowels are an important aspect in the evolution of language. The Greeks first invented the vowels, so we're looking at a period in classical history when vowels were first introduced. The Greeks invented vowels to make reading easier, to pronounce words correctly, and the Jews produced the MT, the Masoretic text, for the very same reason. So vowels also allow us to add more words to a language. Now, my point is this: that changing letters, making new sounds, and adding vowels is not some rare phenomenon that only occurred with the letter J and I. Instead, it occurred over and over again in the history of language in general, but also in the English language. So, language is constantly evolving. The English alphabet itself came from the Romans, which in turn came from the Greeks, which in turn came from the Egyptians and the Phoenicians. Historically, all alphabet and writing itself came from the Sumerians/Akkadians. The Epic of Gilgamesh, if you ever get a chance to read it, is a fascinating piece of literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of those oldest forms of writing we have today. It is the story of the king of Uruk, King Gilgamesh. He lived approximately 2500 BC. But the Sumerian cuneiform writing itself dates back to about 1,000 years earlier, approximately 3400 BC, and that's what's been proven historically so far. Now, just like the Greeks gave us vowels, they also gave us the written form of the English alphabet. In approximately 800 BC, the Greeks changed the Phoenician alphabet into the shapes that we recognize today as our English alphabet. Now, for a quick breakdown of various English alphabet and where they came from, of course, most of them are Semitic in origin, as we've said. A couple are distinctively Phoenician. U is Greek, J is French, English, and appeared approximately in the 14th century. Now, we're concerned with the letter Y, now because Y concerns us in this study. Y is Roman, but going backwards also appears in the Greek and the Phoenician. The letter Y, which is the Hebrew yod, appears in vowel pointing form in the name Yeshua. Now, Y first appears among the Jewish people in approximately 100 AD. We need to remember that the Hebrew language was lost to the Jews during the Babylonian and the Hellenistic periods, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and even Arabic were the languages spoken and written by the Jewish people. The Hebrew as we know it today was only used during the exiled and the Hellenic periods in the synagogue for liturgy and reading of the text. The common Jew was reading, that is, if they were reading at all, because literacy was only reserved for a few and parchment was very expensive. Literate Jews were most likely reading the LXX, the Septuagint in Greek. Speaking of the LXX, we also know that it was read in the home churches in the early church. In the book of Acts, Stephen is quoting from the LXX. 80% of the Old Testament quotes in the New Testament are directly from the LXX. And as a Hellenized Jew, Paul would most likely have been reading the LXX. I have no doubt that Paul would have had access to some Old Testament parchment scrolls in Hebrew, but the Old Testament as we know it today was not canonized until 90 AD at the Council of Javna in the northwest of Jerusalem. So Paul was well and truly dead before that time. The other aspect of the Hebrew language I'd like to point out is that there are two types of Hebrew script: the Old Testament, the Old Hebrew used by the Samaritans, and the Jewish Hebrew script, which has its origins in Aramaic. Now, the reasons why both of them are very similar is because they both share the same roots, which is in the Phoenician language. Now let's get back to the letter J and the name Jesus. There's more to that flyer than meets the eye, which I suppose is what drove me to do this study in the first place. By saying that it's impossible for Jesus to have the letter J in his name, they're saying that Jesus should be called by another name. So, what is this other name that they are implying? Now, because J as a letter, not as a sound, but as a letter, is a fairly new addition to the English language, and we've talked about this all along, some people say we shouldn't call Jesus Jesus. Instead, they say we should call him by his Hebrew name, which is Yeshua. Yeshua, the phonetic spelling according to Strong's, number 3442, and I'm not about to argue with Strong's. However, the same people who say we should call Jesus Yeshua have many different ways of saying Yeshua. To some, he is Yah with an apostrophe Shua, as he's Yeshua, he's Yah, he's Yahusha, he's Yahushua, he's Yeshua, or there's the secret name movement, and you don't actually get to know his name until you join and are baptized. I'll call the people who say these things, that we should call Jesus Yeshua, the Yeshua only people. The Yeshua only people argue that Yeshua was the name given to the Messiah by his mother Mary, Miriam, and his father Joseph. Joseph, by the way, if we choose not to use the letter J. Now let's take a look at the name given to Yeshua by Miriam and Joseph. Isaiah 7:14 is the most famous prophecy that announced the coming Messiah. Now therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, and behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. According to Isaiah 7:14, his name is Emmanuel. Now that's not as contradictory as it sounds. There is an explanation, and I'll talk about it in a minute. I'm also going to tell you some other names that Yeshua, Jesus, has. He has many, many names. And this is evident in the scriptures. You see, when Moses asked God his name, God says, I am that I am, or I am who I am, Exodus 3:14. In Hebrew, it's Ayer, Esher, Ayer. Now, Maimonides, the Rambam, a very smart man, says that this should actually read, I will be whatever I will be, rather than I am what I am. Because you see, every time God reveals an aspect of his name, it is intrinsically linked with an aspect of his character. So when he reveals to us his name, he also reveals to us his character, or the function he is performing at that given time. Now, these are some of the names Yeshua, Jesus, uses to reveal to us aspects of his character. There's Jeremiah 23:6, he shall be called the Lord our righteousness. Isaiah 9:6, his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace, Shalom. Others include the Alpha, the Omega, the branch, the chief shepherd, the door, the I am, the good shepherd, the root, the shoot, the morning star, etc., etc. I was told there were 250 names for Yeshua Jesus in the Bible, but then I discovered a book by a guy called Nathaniel Spears, and he has listed 1,000 names. And I checked them all out, and yes, there are 1,000 names. Now, that is a lot of names. Well, apparently not, according to the Yeshua only people. They say that Emmanuel, Wonderful Counselor, etc., they're not names, they are titles. So, according to them, Yeshua Jesus has only one name and many titles. They use such examples as Dr. Peter Bradford or Professor Kevin Nile to show that individuals can have both a name and a title at the same time. They also say that Pharaoh, king, and priest are titles. No, they're not. And that wonderful counselor, etc., are titles. They're not titles either, because it says his name shall be called and not his title shall be called. Nobody had titles before their names like we do nowadays. They only had names, and wrapped up in their names was their identity and their function. Their name and their identity was one package. That is the ancient Near East concept of a name. We cannot take an ancient Near East concept of a name and apply it to our modern day thinking. We have to keep it in the context in which it was written. In the ancient Near East, they didn't give you a name because your parents liked Jack or Jane or Samantha, or your grandpa was called Eugene. They gave you a name because it was who you were, or more importantly, who you'd become, because your name was your identity. The Hebrew word for name is Shem. Reads more like shame in English according to Strong's number 8034, and it means name in the narrowest and the strictest sense of the word. Shem is translated as name 864 times in the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures. The name of a city, the name of a town, a village, a valley, a mountain, a river, and the name of individuals. They are all Shem. So is the Valley of Elah a title, or is the Mount of Olives a title, or is it just a name given to a mountain? The very first use of the word Shem in Jewish literature, according to Alfred Eldesheen, is that it first appeared in Talmudic writings in the wisdom literature. Now, Alfred Eldesheen is a Jewish scholar, convert to Christianity, and he's one of those rare breeds whose knowledge encompasses Jewish law, the Talmudic writings, ancient history, and the New Testament. In my opinion, that is a great biblical scholar. So when it suits us, we can't just say the name Shem is the Valley of Elah, but the name Shem, a counselor for the Messiah, is not a name, but is a title. We can't chop and change to suit our pet doctrines. The Hebrew word for Shem also has a plural, and it is Shemot, now which means to be or to do. So individuals will be or do their name. They will perform that function according to the name that was given them. As in the case of Isaiah 7:14, his name shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. Emmanuel's function was to come down and from heaven and dwell with man and offer man salvation. And he therefore then becomes God with us. When we accept his salvation, he continues to abide with us. So, depending on what function God is performing at that specific period in history, he will adopt a name that reveals that aspect of his character. The word title is also used in the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, the English Old Testament, about 6 times. Name, Shem, is 864 times. The word for title has a completely different root word to Shem. It is Aramaic in origin, and the word is Kanach. Reads more like Kana according to Strong's 3655. It means to flatter somebody in Job 32:22. But the main meaning of the word kanach is as a signpost, like a gravestone in Ezekiel 39:15, not as we understand title today. By the way, title, titlos, the Greek, has completely the same meaning. It's only used twice in the New Testament, and both times as a sign above the cross of Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, is a title. There are no other titles in the Old Testament or the New Testament. There are only names. Finally, Israel is both a name and a title. Isaiah 45 verses 3 to 5 is very interesting because it uses both the words Shem, name, and title, Kanak, in the same verses side by side. So God says to Israel, I have named you, that I have Shemmed you, and I've also Kanaked you. So I've also entitled you. I've named you and I've titled you Israel. And Israel is as a signpost. So there you have it, names and titles, not as we understand them. The Old Testament is a Hebrew and Aramaic book, and the New Testament is a Greek book. Neither of them were an English book. English didn't exist then, so we can't take a modern English concept of names and titles and apply it to an ancient Near East concept. It just doesn't work. In the next session, I'll talk more about Emmanuel and the name Yeshua, and I'll talk a bit more about Isaiah 7:14. His name shall be called Emmanuel. I'll discuss it in some detail. Thank you for listening.